So it didn't say live stream has started, but the YouTube thing shows it. So the audio indicator just isn't working for some reason on Jitsi.
Oh, that's weird.
Yeah. Yeah, in Jitsi itself, it still says starting live stream, but I can see it on YouTube already.
Is Brian going today? Or?
I don't think he mentioned anything about not being able to make it. Yeah, he didn't mention not being able to do it. Because the only thing he posted since last week was the LLVM release announcement for 11.
He'll probably be here.
Yeah. So, Paul, I don't actually know on x86 what each register does, but what is the significance of switching between RDI and RSI for the apply fix? Switching which register to use.
I assume you're talking about the changes to the dynamic apply assembly?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, there's some mistakes in there because I had shifted registers around.
Oh, okay.
And one of them was referencing the wrong register for the arguments array. It was instead referencing the register containing the function callee.
Oh, okay. So is that just an assembly thing, or is the calling convention actually different now? It's still if you don't have an environment, we don't pass it, right? None of that changed?
Right, but that happens at a level above, right? So
okay.
That assembly shim is just doing the actual application of the function according to the sysv calling convention. So, aside from that, all the functions that are doing high level, okay, we have a closure, does it have an environment, what to do with that code didn't really change. I mean, I did for the minimal runtime because the less stuff that happens there, the better. But I forget what all the changes were that happened in that area, but there's a few things around closures in particular that needed to be addressed. One of the bugs that had been open on the tracker was due to that issue I fixed in the assembly shim.
Is it the bug where the arguments get shifted over one and one of them becomes none when it's in a closure?
Yeah, it's not that it gets shifted over one, but that it was not being it was just referencing the wrong memory, so it was passing nonsense garbage values.
Okay. Well, I mean,
there's a number of changes around closures, so there's more than one bug that was addressed as those changes.
Okay.
And some of it fell out of the type system work that was happening as well. So I wouldn't look at that as addressing one specific thing, but as fixing bugs that either we already have open on the tracker or things I found when I was fixing those bugs. So.
Okay.
The conflicts between develop and my branch I'm resolving right now. What I'm doing is reverting the commit that adds the global dynamic implementation, splitting out the tests into a commit containing those. And then once I merge my stuff into develop, well, actually as part of my branch, I'm just going to make your commit, but in the what I'll call canonical way for doing those kinds of implementations.
Yeah, you probably changed how you did it, because I copied the old invoke, and if you change how invoke and call works, then it's going to be different now.
Yeah, I mean, there's no need to have a dedicated operation specifically for like static or non-static calls, because calls are just being lowered as like apply in some cases.
Oh,
It depends,
I
but
didn't see the apply branch. It had the callee symbol, and so we would need the to be able to resolve the full name. I thought.
I'm not saying that we reuse the build static call part,
Oh, okay.
but rather that the implementation of actually like lowering a dynamic call only really needs just a little bit of sort of argument manipulation, and then just lowering to a static call to apply 3.
Oh, so instead of having a different MLI or C function and a different op, and then canonicalizing to apply 3, you would lower directly to apply 3.
Yes.
Okay, well that's fine.
Yeah, and just for future reference, like using, you don't want to use canonicalization patterns for like you were doing for that. That's kind of for a different purpose. I mean, it effectively works, but not for the reasons that you
Right.
think.
So I did canonicalization because I first tried conversion, and then I realized that didn't work because the way we're doing conversion is between dialects. And so I'm like, okay, canonicalization then, and then it worked. But yeah, I didn't have any confidence.
You need to add a lowering basically for those calls, but it's like redundant since the vast majority of that implementation is the same as regular calls, but there is some differences, right? But rather than generating all the boilerplate for all that, like it's way easier in the module builder to just generate the code to call apply 3 right away. And then that also lets other, canonicalization patterns or rewrite patterns to then look for things that are dynamic, but for which we can constantly resolve the some value there.
I thought it would work the other way, where it was better to keep it as a separate op as long as possible, because I didn't know if the rewrite patterns cared more. Like make it apply 3 only when it could prove not to be constant and be something else, and so that's why I assumed that it was better to apply 3 as late as possible. But if it works the other way, then yeah, then it makes sense to do it higher up.
I would say it's very situational. Sometimes you do want a dedicated op because it allows you to reason about things better when you're doing optimizations or canonicalizations / rewrites. But in the case of calls, that isn't really the case so much. We want to treat them like any other call and let them participate in the same optimizations. The only thing that we would add is a canonicalization, which I already had in place but needed to be updated, but which is like the call indirect, which when we know that, like we originally lowered an indirect call or dynamic call, but then during the course of doing constant propagation and stuff, we actually can identify what the concrete callee is. Then we can drop all the dynamic boilerplate garbage and just turn it into a static call.
I did have a question of that. What is the difference between the call closure functions and call indirect? I didn't understand what indirect is.
So call indirect doesn't exist anymore. I stripped out a bunch of stuff that was either dead or didn't need to exist anymore. So all that was in the changes that I pushed this morning. There's too many changes really to even mention, but if you have questions about anything in particular, feel free to ask.
Yeah,
a lot of those are dependent on me getting a new LVM release out, which I'm working on right now.
Okay, so that's the confirmation for the CI break, is that it doesn't have your LVM. So that
yeah, it's like way behind. So there are further changes that I'll make once we get all this stuff merged, like some recent stuff again that was added to MLIR that will further reduce the amount of boilerplate we need, but it's not super critical, so I'm getting the rest of this stuff done instead. But yeah, go ahead.
Did you see the thread on LVM about adding new operations for manipulating the DAG from table gen? Would that help us for making our rewrite rules not have to use actual C code and just use the declarative form in table gen? Like, do we have a dog in that race? Do we
Possibly.
care?
Like, there are probably some things that we can use the declarative rewrite rules for, but in general, most of the patterns that we're recognizing aren't great fits for that because they're fairly conditional and specific, and are essentially, they fall out of the patterns we produce when lowering code. So as an artifact or a byproduct of how we generate code in the front end, we produce certain code gen patterns in the back end. We then write canonicalization or rewrite patterns that collapse those or, optimize them in some way. And, if those patterns are simple enough, then the declarative rewrite rules can be used. And those are nice when you can use them. What I found though is that currently they're too limited to be able to really do much of use with those. But that change that you mentioned has a reasonably high likelihood of improving the flexibility there, but I'm not sure to what degree that's gonna, fix the specific problems I ran into, which is that, I'll find like, I wanna canonicalize this pattern of things that occur when we're lowering like a chain of, Boolean operations. Well, that depends on me being able to bind, different values as Booleans. So for example, we have a Boolean type and an atom type, and we also use I1 in certain cases where the operation itself produces like a primitive Boolean type switch. And all those get treated uniformly with the canonicalizations and the rest of the code gen stuff. But when you want to do canonicalizations and bind to values, it's currently very difficult to do that in a way that works across different types. I wrote some binders to make that easier, and I haven't revisited the declarative rewrite rules to see if, with the presence of the binders I added, that it makes those rules easier to express. That's something we're going to have to continually evaluate as we add more of those. My hope is that, as the infrastructure there improves, less and less boilerplate needs to be written to do simple things. And it has been improving like by leaps and bounds pretty much every month. But, for the most part, we're not writing very complex canonicalizations at this point either. And that was one of the benefits of rewriting most of all the type system stuff and the CodeGen backend is, the way it was before made it virtually impossible to really reason about things. And now that the types are a little bit richer and more specific, it's much easier to write patterns that, can do what we want them to do. There's a bunch of patterns that I wrote in there that take very verbose IR that gets generated and collapse them down into dead simple things. Removes a lot of redundancy, a lot of repetition, like redundant casts and things like that. That'll only improve as we get more of a type system on the front end and can pass more metadata along to CodeGen. Right now, it's just things that I know that I can infer based on constant values or based on the, operation result type, if it's constant. And then I propagate those types as much as possible. But, that's limited also because if you have like a set of blocks, a chain of blocks where they fork and on different edges to the, terminator block, they have different types, well, then you've lost your ability to reason about that. One of the things you can do is split those blocks and then have more specialized operations in both of those, but that probably is not super fruitful without more of a type system in place than we have now. But some of those optimizations are now present in the changes I push. So, feel free to take a look at some of those, how they're written. And if you, notice patterns in the generated MLIR that seem like they're redundant, we can discuss whether or not it makes sense to rewrite patterns for those. in general, I'd like to, instead of generating rewrite patterns for things to clean up garbage, I'd rather not generate garbage in the first place. And so it's a bit of a balancing act between the two. Sometimes generating the garbage makes it easier to, it simplifies the lowering code itself and makes it easier to reason about things to do optimizations. But on the flip side, if you don't take care of stripping away all that redundancy, you've bloated your code size and made things way slower than they need to be. So we'll probably have to keep refining that as we improve like EIR in the front end, get more metadata there, do more optimizations there. Like we can either strip away canonicalizations or rewrites that we're doing in the back end, or change them as necessary if they're no longer applicable. Sorry, losing my voice.
I joined a few minutes late, Paul. I assume that was in reference to 582, the conversation?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it's a bit of a misnomer to refer to 582 as a PR in the first place. It's basically just a separate branch, but opened as a PR. But yeah.
I know. I'm not sure if the conversation started off this way, but I wanted to kind of get a sense on where you feel like you are in terms of landing that, because I know it's operating as a blocker in different ways.
Yeah, we're getting that merged today, basically.
Okay, cool.
Blocker is getting the LLVM release out.
Yep.
And I'm resolving some conflicts between that branch and develop, but those are fairly small. So.
Okay. Looks like Lars just joined.
Oh.
So let me just step in my update real quick, which will kind of interrupt the technical talk. But Jim and I finally had a conversation. He doesn't feel that his platform would be ready in time for something that we would want to do for, say, Q1 or Q2. I think he's right now aiming for, he said like mid to late Q2 or sometime in Q2. And just knowing how software goes, I'm not going to bank on that. So I think that if we're going to do something, whether we're not calling it a conference, if we're calling it like a webinar or whatever, we should just do it on like YouTube streaming. We can probably set up something a little bit more formal than that, where there is either a back channel chat in Slack or someplace where people can interact, and we can have like a schedule of if we have like 2 or 3 presentations where they're going on one after the other, so that they're not overlapping. But as far as using Jim's platform, I don't think that we should wait on that.
I will say after the LLVM developers meeting, the Hoover now isn't just a mobile app. They actually have a web version, and it's not that bad. Like the Zoom integration is weird, but the fact that like the Hoover questions show up next to the video. So like on the mobile app, you can ask questions ahead of time, and it's kind of disconnected. You have to remember to check your phone. In the actual like web view, they're just sitting there next to the video. And the way that LLVM did it was they actually pre-recorded the talks, but then like kind of like the premiere thing on YouTube, they live streamed on each track one talk. And so then while it was live streaming, people could be asking live questions. And since the person wasn't actually giving the talk, they could instantly respond or wait until after the talk and do a question session from all the ones that had been gathered during the video being played.
Yeah, I looked at Hoover. I spoke to Jim about it. I don't know if some new things have come about since when he decided not to use it. He expressed some concerns all over the platform's flexibility to run things that he wanted to run it. That being said, what we would do would not be as in-depth as LixerConf. The thing with Hoover though is that it costs money, and their pricing page is one of those like request a quote, which means that it tells me it's big money. So I can send out a quote request and see if that's true or not, but we don't have any budget to do something.
LLVM could afford it because like their sponsors are Google, Apple, and Qualcomm. Like there is money behind LLVM even for the meeting, because like the foundation is a nonprofit too, so all those companies can just throw money at it for tax deductions.
Mhm.
I talk to the code sync people and see if it is particularly expensive, because like ElectroConf EU and CodeBeam and CodeMesh, they all use it. I haven't loved the experience of the Hoover app, I must say.
The mobile application or the virtual conference version?
All of it. It's
Okay.
the conference application was good when I went to Prague,
Right.
because then it was like 2 days ahead. I was there 2 days ahead because it was Prague, and meeting up with people and like getting in touch with the conference people before the conference was sweet, because that leads to beer and karaoke. So
I've actually had some pretty good conversations because of Hoover's application for the in-person conferences. So I've always found it to be decent in that regard. I didn't
like it for virtual. The web environment it's all fine, but none of it feels good to me.
When I ran the CodeBeam panel on most recently that Hans was part of, I was using the Hoover application for taking questions, and it wasn't perfect. It got the job done, but my take on it is that I think even if it costs $1, we wouldn't do Hoover, just for the sake of keeping it simple. I'd also be concerned that if we opt into like a conference platform, that number one, it's perceived as a conference, which we don't want to have done. And number two, we're now left with all these additional functionality that we may feel compelled to opt into, and then it becomes more than we're biting off more than we're willing to chew. So for the purposes of just getting the messaging out there of Lumen and presenting stuff, YouTube live stream, I think, is sufficient. If we're concerned around people being able to ask questions in real time, that YouTube supports that. And really, I think it just comes down to a matter of really promoting it beforehand to ensure that there is attendance. Anyway, that's my take on it. But I still will send in for the quote on Hoover. If it happens to be free, then we can, if maybe they have a tier, like if you're doing a free event, you use Hoover for free. I don't know. That could be a possibility. If that's the case, maybe we can take it into consideration.
Yeah, I think we'd be mostly fine with something like YouTube.
Yeah,
YouTube's probably fine.
And
it's not as
there's beauty,
which is weird.
If it's simple, people are more likely to tune in. The nice thing about YouTube too is that people can pull it up on their phones trivially. So I think there's a little bit of value in not really overthinking, especially for something that we're essentially just kind of doing on our own, not really like a conference thing at all. It's more or less just us presenting things about the project and trying to get more community involvement, that kind of thing. So
we can also, if we just present the Slack channel or whatever like communications platform we want as like, this is where we are right now, this is where you can ask us questions, maybe that could encourage people to come and do that in the future as well, outside of the conference. If we really push opening up the chat room for people, then
either that or opening a channel, just Lumen Talks or something.
Okay. My next step is then I'm going to just kind of run this by Jose and Jim, just so they're not blindsided by us going ahead and doing this. And I'll be clear that this is not a conference, it's not a competitive type of event, any way, shape, or form. I just want to kind of get their, give them a heads up and get their okay on it. So we're not causing any waves or anything.
Yeah, very polite.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like we're trying to split off and do our own conference thing or whatever.
Right. In the lack of formal explanation, people can tend to form their own opinions.
Right. Yeah.
So I'd rather just say, hey, here's exactly what we're doing, here's where we're doing it, rather than just have it be
better to avoid confusion or the potential for confusion, no question.
Yeah. And maybe not title it like Lumen Conf, time to exterminate the bee.
Yeah, not a good start.
All right.
The disintegration of Erlang.
Here's the schism, the great schism. Of
Yeah.
Erlang. Yeah, we won't do that. All right. So Lars, do you want to give an update? You've been pretty active with some of the new stuff on the website.
Yeah, mostly hassling these good gents. Yeah, I just have some editing to do before I push out the next post. And I guess my only question or thing to raise is, does this seem like a good approach to y'all?
Yeah, it does. The only, I think, Luke, have you been tweeting? Because I saw the one that was late September.
I've been bad about using our Twitter.
Okay.
Yeah,
in that case, do we want to just give Lars access so he can?
Yeah, we can do.
You have a Twitter?
Yeah, so
I know.
it's get Lumen because Lumen was already taken by some other people. So it matches the website name, and I can. We have it set up as like a team management system. Where like we just add your Twitter account as we know to manage this Twitter account, so you can use the account switcher on the bottom of Twitter to like post as Lumen.
We need to center the Lumen logo.
It's not
the cropping thing didn't work.
That's funny.
Yeah,
or maybe just shrink it down so it fits in there.
Yeah,
that's the other option.
I feel pretty good about the process. I mean, granted, I haven't had to be super involved at this point.
Yeah, you haven't.
My changes have not been committed to develop, but that's obviously going to change today. Plenty of work for you now. Not really. I mean, just I'll write up a summary of the things that changed, but
yeah, as long as everyone's happy with me occasionally pinging them GitHub and then hassling you all when things aren't happening, I'm good with this.
Yeah, it's all great.
That's it for me.
Cool. Luke.
So I did a stab at Global Dynamic, which we discussed. Like, it works, but Paul's going to fix it so it works right with the new changes. I supported the fact that EIR groups like repeated ands or ors together as a single operation by lowering it to just a bunch of binary operations that are chained together, so that the OTP uses of multiple ands or ors altogether. I think for guards, I didn't actually check when it was being used.
Oh, that reminds me. Before I forget this, because my ADHD brain, with that, is there a particular reason why we want to lower logical operators with like more than 2 operands? Like, is it simplify something in the front end? Like,
it's guards basically. Guards lower trivially to like a sequence of or and then an AND operation with like n operands.
Sure, but implicit in that then is that those sequences may, like, you may short circuit, right? In some cases, depends on what's in a guard.
So the reason why it's a prim up is that the prim ups, like if you have an AND with only one value, then it just like doesn't exist. It just falls through to the value. That's how it happens in building prim ups. So that's why it's a prim up in the IR, because it simplifies when we're using it. I think there's another case too when those logical prim ups are used, but we could lower it to calls to like Erlang or whatever repeatedly, but
no, I mean, it's fine to have prim ups. That's not really what I was getting at so much as like I'm a little bit confused on what the semantic meaning of like logical or and operator with 3 or 4 operands is, right?
It's like with an and with n operands. I think it's documented in the primop file. But with a and with n operands, it's like if every single one of them is like true, then it returns true. With an or, if any one of them is true, then it returns true.
Got it.
But the order of application does matter because we know it does in Erlang, like because you're able to guard protect yourself. So
Oh
it's
no,
not,
this is different.
oh,
It isn't used in those cases. The primop is only used in cases when you know that the input type is a Boolean.
oh, okay. Well, I mean, in that case, maybe lowering it to a bunch of logical ORs in ML in EIR MLIR isn't right, because if we know they're all Boolean, we know they're all 1 bits, which means can we do some sort of like pop count thing or something to make it more efficient?
Well, I mean, I already do constant propagation and collapsing of logical operations
Yeah, that's
and
done.
canonicalization patterns.
That's done with primops too. Like it all like simplifies it and disappears if it can be simplified. But like I don't think there's like a whole lot. It's only used in cases where like it's not like using the primop. The advantage isn't that it gives us any more information. It's more that it's just simpler in the places where it's used, because it's only used in places where you know that the input is Boolean. So it just simplifies like constructing the IR, and it just generates simpler IR from the front end.
Yeah, I don't see like a problem with it or whatever, but I was uncertain where that change originated and like what it meant, right? So what are the semantics of it? If the semantics are, this is just a convenient shorthand for chained like ors or ands, then that's fine. Like we can reason about that. Just like Luke had pointed out, or well, he already implemented, is we can just drop that to a chain of binary operators in MLIR.
Yeah, I did that so that the operations didn't have to not be binary operations, because I assumed that was a bigger change and I didn't want to do that.
Yeah, and I don't want that. Like in the cogen backend, like with the exception of things like calls or whatever, you know, operations that have a variadic number of operands, like it's much easier to reason about unary and binary operators than it is like arbitrarily, you know, n-ary kind of operators. Like it's way easier for us to write patterns against binaries.
Even LLVM is like really good at like chains of binary operations anyway, so it's not like
yeah, I mean, at that point too, you know, we are looking to be more explicit at that point and simplify operations. Like I think it makes sense at the front end to, you know, to have something that sort of collapses those into a more convenient shorthand. It, like as you pointed out, simplifies the IR at that point. You know, and it can be reasoned about just as well. Like it doesn't matter at that point. It's only when we start doing code generation where we take those more complex super ops and expand them out into like their more primitive forms, and then do another, you know, set of canonicalization and everything at that stage. But, you know, it's always going to be the case that we're going to have two places where some of those things seem like they're redundant, but to a certain degree, it's because we have different sets of information to operate on at those two different phases of the compiler. So it makes sense to me. I just wanted to ask you about that.
Yep.
Sorry, Luke, I had interrupted you. You were about to press on.
Oh, I will say with the logical OR, there is still stuff that complains about logical OR because the dominance thing. You maybe fix that in the branch. I know you talked about it before, but if you still see stuff about logical OR, it's something where like, you know, the value is getting pulled to both branches or something. A couple of those was that weird thing where that Hansami talked about, where Erlang allows you like inside of an if to define the variable on both branches, and then it counts as being defined outside of the if. Like it's not technically in there. So those are another weird places where it looks like the ORs, the logical ORs, logical ANDs aren't working. Just to be aware.
That should be getting lowered to something else. Yeah.
Right. So just be aware. Just be aware that like if you're looking at that, once your branch is when you're trying to merge your branch, like there's potentially those still exist for other reasons. Other thing I did.
You have a legalization pass for when a primop gets scheduled at like a terminal branch where it needs to be visible higher up the dominance tree. You have like a
Yeah.
legalization pass that moves it up. So that should
I
take
do.
care of all cases.
I mean, the only thing that, you know, it could be an issue there is if there's a bug in that implementation. But a whole bunch of that stuff was rewritten and shuffled around. So we'll have to revisit some of those bugs as part of that. I mean, I have dumped a bunch of those issues into Erlang files that I then run the compiler against to validate that those things have been addressed. So each of the problems that I fixed on that branch, you know, I went through that process with them. So I don't recall specifically, you know, where that landed, but like one of the very first things I started working on was kind of rewriting all the binary operators. So the comparisons, logical and or, those have all been like, you know, touched up, so to speak, essentially completely rewritten.
Another thing you can check with your type changes is there's like a few to maybe a dozen places where the like implicit casts weren't happening. So like the last argument will be like, this didn't work because the last thing was a box cons. And so if you look at the build output for the OTP builds now, and you don't see them once your changes go in, then you know you fixed that bug also, which will be nice.
Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about. Yeah, pretty much anything that is type related or, you know, if you were getting MLIR diagnostics because ops were invalid, basically any of those you will have to consider like potentially fixed but not confirmed until we've gone through the list of issues and made sure that they're all addressed. But
so when your PR lands, when we do the post on it, I can, assuming I have time since I finally have access now on the client, so I can actually do client work. I can go through and compare the two build outputs of the OTP build, and then we can assign that, you know, this thing that we saw about the OTP build was fixed by your changes, so that, you know, the news looks
sure, yeah,
more impressive or more like user facing of what changed, I guess.
Yeah, more helpful. Most
Yeah.
people aren't going to necessarily understand what the significance of some of the changes are, so makes sense.
My other changes was GitHub finally, which I always thought was a weird thing, like we used to set the environment by just echoing a special string, which if you think about that, anything else that also prints the standard out could have just echoed that string and changed our environment or changed our path. So
Yeah.
there was a CVE about that, and now they don't do that anymore. So it pops up as a little warning that, hey, you need to stop doing that and use environment files, so we do that instead. So you echo the environment file or the path you want to change to an environment file that defines like, here's the file that the runner is going to read to do the environment variables for your next run. And that way the actual output of like a make command can't do the special set path string or whatever anymore. So that was one of my 670 does that. So it fixes our build so we don't get those warnings about the CV that GitHub had. And then I did one more to, I stubbed out some undefined symbols for OTP, and then I have another one that I'm still working on to stub out everything that seek trace needs, just so that it will link and not complain. So it's not actually implementing sequential tracing because I don't know if we'll ever actually do it. It's just enough to get it to link and not complain, and sometimes a little bit of argument validation because that was simple enough to do. And that way those will at least link for OTP even if we never end up supporting them in Lumen.
Are they used by things?
Literally the seek trace.url file needs it, and that way we don't have that not building. That's why I'm doing it.
Well, sure. Well, I guess what I'm saying is like when we're actually building our like, you know, runtime library to ship with the compiler, we don't want to ship binaries that contain a bunch of stuff that will never be used. You know what I mean? It's useful to run the compiler against source files that we're not necessarily including, just to make sure that we don't have like weird, you know, compiler bugs because there's some old construct or whatever in those source files. But if we're not using them, it's just redundant work, you know, takes more space, takes longer to build, never gets used.
I don't know. I mean, it depends whether we think sequential tracing will be useful. So sequential tracing is the one where like it follows the path of messages, but it would require actual runtime changes to really support it because you need the process to like hold that. Like the way Beam does it is that sequential tracing is like a memory slot in the process that keeps track of like what's the label I'm using, what's like a serial number that increments every time you do something, and like who sent the message last. And so obviously we shouldn't do that part of it because that part of the runtime can't be optimized out. But the actual like liblumen OTP functions, if they're never used, they won't do anything, so they'll be fine for now.
Oh yeah, so what I'm saying is like we can always add additional components into the builds, either as we add support for them or make it sort of an optional package. But I don't think we want to build like a all-in-one OTP library that contains like a bunch of stuff that can't be used or won't be used because either they're not supported or it's dead code because we can't actually call it for some reason, or superseded by something else we've provided as part of the runtime. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying that there's not value in running the compiler against those things, just that for shipping a library with the compiler, we'll always need to have like a way to say, do our sort of like release build that's like does not compile anything that is not needed.
Most I did it because it was one of the OTP things that is broke that I could fix without touching CodeGen.
Sure, I'm not saying you did something wrong here or something. That's not my point.
Yeah, like I'm fine if we don't have it. I was actually going to say that we potentially could strip down like liblumen OTP is altogether because the Erlang module is a kitchen sink, but just the same way that like we define init start in the Erlang code, but init like get plain arguments in other code, like they don't have to be in the same crate or shared library because we fixed the export name. So in theory, we could break up even the Erlang module into multiple crates into a grouping of functions that are related. Like that all the sequential trace stuff goes somewhere, or all the we group parts of the binary module and the binary related parts of the Erlang module in one crate. We could do that later, so then we could make it much easier to tune down the size of what you ship.
Yeah, I think there's definitely going to be some modularity concerns there that we want to provide some knobs to tweak basically, and a certain amount of that can be done with link time optimization by saying we're going to give you the Erlang application as a single library, shared library, or stack library, it doesn't really matter. But the point is, we've given you this thing. And then when you actually compile your application, we can provide the tools to say, strip anything that's not actually used by my code. And that would then take advantage of the link time optimization and not be part of like our own like filtering of things, right? And that plays into the dead code elimination, things like that. The more that we have in a single translation unit, the better we can do dead code elimination. The more split up things are, the harder it gets, and even makes it impossible in some cases. We have some fundamental limitations on top of that we have to kind of reason about, which is, with the presence of dynamic calls and things like that, that sort of gets in the way of being able to do dead code elimination. So we've already discussed like the different approaches there, but one of the things that I think would help us a great deal there is taking advantage of behaviors to sort of identify which modules are probably actually used. So we can do some dead code elimination without having to just say, don't eliminate anything, or be hyper aggressive about it. We've talked about other ideas like having users annotate things or provide some project metadata that tells us what they want stripped or not stripped. But all those are different ways to kind of tweak that input. In the compiler itself, we're going to have to centralize that to a certain degree so that we can then reason about it, right? Either as a source of metadata that the compiler can query to say, do I care about this module? Should I skip compiling it? Are there symbols in this library that I need? You know, that kind of thing. So
I got to drop off too. I have another call.
Yeah, that covered all my stuff.
Okay.
all right.
See you guys.
The fuck. I hate how this happens. That is what I want to ask. So Hans, with the front ends, I had mentioned like a couple weeks back about being able to pass down attributes, module attributes, or contextual attributes, anyways, to CodeGen.
Yeah. So
is that something that we've made any progress on, or not
I
yet?
have a very clear design in mind for it. Like it's not a lot of work, but it's just that I've been trying to keep up with like the issues with the front end, like fixing all the problems there.
Yeah,
There's like it's playing whack-a-mole, fixing all the problems. But I'll prioritize doing that since it shouldn't take a long time, and I'll try to get at least some rough.
I think we
after.
can make use of that, fairly short order, even if we don't have the full, implementation of that, like totally complete. The main thing that I want is to be able to pass compile flags, like Lumen compiler flags, to CodeGen to be able to reason about that. And then ultimately, when we add some kind of type system in place, I imagine that's going to be one way that we could deliver that then to the backend. There's probably different ways that you could deal with that with the type information, but
so
I think in general, just arbitrary metadata is the important thing.
Yeah, with type information, I want to make that more part of the IR. But for like attributes, that's obviously like something. Just having arbitrary attributes is not a lot of work to do, but it's really useful to have.
Yeah, I think as far as like debugging info and things like that, it allows us to kind of embellish things a little bit.
I will say some of the other fixes, I got fixed enough stuff that at least one of the apps in the OTP compile test now hit the fact that we don't support the file directive. So making sure that works as part of your test with the module attributes. And obviously that's going to be a special attribute in that we want it to inform the debug info.
We didn't support that? I could have sworn we had support for that attribute.
There's a specific error that like we must hit a point where like we knew we had to support the file attribute, but it shows up as unimplemented or to do or something.
No, and particularly in the handling around includes, I think in the preprocessor stuff, there had to have been some logic to say we're like in an include file, so set the contextual attribute for source.
So it might be that got through because of spans where like the include is saying the span for you, but like we're not handing the explicit file directive, which happens for one of the OTP apps.
Interesting. Oh, maybe that's why we never like added direct support for that, just because God, I don't know, like a lot of sort of churn happened in the preprocessor stuff, so I guess I don't remember where things ended up. And Hans, I know you did a bunch of work in there too, so.
But I'll have to look at the specific issue to know anything.
I haven't opened an issue about it. It's in the OTP build output. I can find a link for you.
So is the issue that the attribute's not supported, or there's some failure due to not finding the file or something like it?
No, it's like to do and something about the file directive.
Oh, okay.
I'll like if you can just give me the file it happens in, then I'll look at it. But
yeah, I can link to like the starting line in the build output for the way the runners work for GitHub Actions. I can link closer to it.
That would be awesome. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I'm wondering, like, if we probably want to think carefully about that. So the file attribute, we want that metadata for debug information, but for source spans, I don't think we want it.
So that's what I've been doing so far. I mentioned sometime earlier that I have two versions of like in the debug info for different parts of the source. I have two bits of information. I have like the raw like module functionality and the line and column. So that's meant to be used for debug info. But then I also have the source span in there as well. So the front end takes care of rendering out the source span to a specific like location that gets attached to them, and then so just making the file attribute affect the like rendered info, but not the source span. Like, yeah, I mean the file directive making that affect only
one
the
thing
rendered
that
info.
seems like it would be valuable when we're compiling Elixir code is, you know, we're going to be in a situation where we're essentially dealing with the Erlang AST of that, which will have file directives in it. And it probably is useful for the Lumen compiler output to show the Elixir source that originally like produces the code that we're erroring on, or, you know, the diagnostic is related to. And then also as a secondary span or note, the Erlang source file that we're actually like compiling, right?
So
that would
the file directive is also important because EX does that to say that like to blame the file directive when EX produces the Erlang AST, it uses the equivalent of the file directive to say, go look in this EX file for the, like this function is coming from this EX file and not the module, not the Erlang module that you're compiling the function that is the EX code into.
Right, yeah. And I think that's the point here, is that the file attribute would set the primary source span, but if we preserve the secondary span effectively, like the place that contains that file directive, then we can show both places.
Oh yeah, I definitely think
relevant.
I definitely think both is better. I mean, this goes back to the problem of the Erlang and the AST not being able to track a chain of blame for like which file you're in for includes or for this. And if we can, that's great. Like it's way better.
And I think we can do that. In fact, I think the way the source stuff is set up right now, probably that would work by having the file attribute itself contain the source span for the region to which it applies, and then the code that attribute affects then has the span that it gets from the file attribute, if that makes sense. So, except for fuck, that's not going to work, right?
Well,
and there's no way to work backwards to the file attribute span. I think there needs to be some kind of notion of inheritance, I guess. But that's fucked. That adds a whole lot of complexity.
I
don't know.
have, like what I have right now is I have the notion of this file is like when you include a file from another file, there is the notion in the span handling, like source. I mean the code map parts that this piece of source is included via this other piece of source, and that's how I track includes.
But is that
so then,
oh right, you
have
fused locations, and I have support for that in MLIR as well. That's probably all we need. I think the thing that might be missing, or the missing ingredient here, is actually fusing locations at those points. So when a file attribute is set, all the code for which that span applies effectively should get a fused location, not one location.
Yes.
And then that would allow us then to
just having
use
some
one
sort
as
of
the primary, others as secondary.
Just having the fused location, just having like on the components, just adding attributes on the different parts of it that could like make things really powerful.
Yeah.
So that you can have several locations, which is like the real, like like if we merge future locations together, like we do when we inline a function or something, then we just like concatenate them together. And then if we ever want to get like the real stack trace or something, then we just look at the parts of that future location with a certain attribute that we want for that type.
Yeah, that could work. Or it could even be an ordering thing, you know, where the fused locations, you know, necessarily have sort of an implicit order in which they're fused, because it's just a vector of spans, essentially. The primary span would always be the first span, and then everything else is secondary. I mean, there's
then
never going to be a
want
case where we have more like 3 or 4 locations.
But in the case where we do inlining, we probably want to preserve all the primary spans and the secondary spans.
When we're doing inlining, the source spans would always just be the original spans, though, from the source. Like the inlining doesn't change the debug info.
But when you inline one function into another function, we want to preserve the stack trace.
Oh, well, yeah, but that already is the case. Like,
yes, but
as long as the code that gets inlined has the original span, the debug info that we generate is going up. You're talking about something that's separate from debug information. You're talking about actually preserving the presence of a stack frame, and I don't agree with that.
No.
Inline functions don't need to have an explicit frame.
No. That's not what I mean. I mean preserving the debug information when doing inlining. When eliminating the need for that extra stack frame, then we need to so like say a line in a function has a primary span and a secondary span, like for the original source file where we actually read it from, and for what we get from the file attribute. When that gets inlined in the place of a call operation in another function, which also has a primary and secondary span, we're going to end up with a fused location with 4 spans. So then we need some way of
wait, hold on a second. The EIR is like when it does inlining, which I didn't think it did. It probably shouldn't be.
It does inlining within a function in the case where you have a anonymous function or a named function inside the function, and then it inlines that function and it merges the locations. Like
but what is the semantics of a fused location where like that sounds like both the caller and callee is blended, but if you're in the inline code, you're effectively in the body of that function. Like there's no notion of a call, like the caller location is lost. It's essentially not relevant because a call never happens. You immediately step into the body of the callee. So I'm not sure where the debug information would ever matter for the caller. You know what I mean? Those source spans are never going to be presented anywhere or shown. Sort of implicitly jumping over it because the call is elided. You know what I mean? Like the way this stuff works, like not EIRs inlining, but in MLIR with locations when, and it's effectively this is LLVM's behavior. When a callee is inlined into the caller, we lost him.
Yeah. Oh, there was a talk at the LLVM conf about how to merge locations when doing optimizations for debug info to follow like the rules of LLVM. And there were a couple ones about like if you're rearranging operations, like when LLVM considers it valid to like have, you know, like your debug cursor jump around. One that they did, I don't think we do this yet, but if we ever do an optimization is like a speculative assign where like, you know, where we move an assignment up and like on one of the branches in the original Erlang code, it's not supposed to look like that actually would have happened. You should remove the debug info from that speculative assign so that it doesn't accidentally look like the cursor jumps to code that wouldn't have really executed in the original code. And I don't know if that matters for how we schedule the code when we're doing like the dominance tree stuff.
That kind of like generated stuff at the LVM level we would not attach debug info to those operations. Or if we did, it would inherit like the location of whatever point in the function it's being inserted.
But does this influence, you know, the problem you were having where like it said that the value doesn't dominate because you were scheduling, you know, an operation in this branch because you saw it first, but it actually need to be up in both of them because both branches needed it?
Well, I mean, it's still going to effectively appear as if that scheduling matches the source.
Okay.
So we're essentially doing what would have happened in the source code anyways, but EIR treats those schedulings as what would have happened in the source code anyways, but EIR treats those schedulings as tentative floating. And so it actually schedules, it doesn't schedule them, but you know, those operations appear closest to their use. But in the source code, it wouldn't have happened that way because you know, you have to define it before it gets used somewhere.
Right. I'm just thinking if the closest to use, I guess, would it ever be the case that the way EIR hands you the code for code gen, if you do like A equals 1, B equals 2, they're obviously not influenced by each other. The order could be either way, and then depending on which one you use, would the assignment flip so that when you step through the debug info, it goes B and then up to A? Like, is it going to seem like it's going out of order unless we make sure EIR